As noted in my letter dated 14 February, I have invited Ms. Amos, Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Ms. Pillay, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Dr. Chan, Director General of the World Health Organization, and Mr. Guterres, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, to brief membership on this pressing matter. I take this opportunity to warmly welcome the Secretary General and our distinguished briefers to this meeting. Ms. Amos was unable to join us today. However, Ms. Kang, Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, is joining us on her behalf. Ms. Pillay and Mr. Guterres are joining us via video conference. I now give the floor to our Secretary General, His Excellency Ban Ki-moon. Secretary General.
Thank you. Your Excellency, Ambassador John Ash, President of the General Assembly, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. The scale and severity of humanitarian suffering in Syria is growing daily. Following my remarks, you will hear harrowing presentations by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the High Commissioner for Refugees, the Director General of the World Health Organization, and the Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator. We gathered just 3 days after the Security Council unanimously adopted a resolution that we hope will make a difference on the ground. As I said at the time of its adoption, this resolution should not have been necessary. We need access to hundreds of thousands of people in the Northeast who have received hardly any help for 3 years. We need to contain the spread of polio by continuing the vaccination campaign. Civilians who want to move freely out of conflict zones should be able to do so. Medical centers must no longer be used to house fighters and store arms. There must be an end to the indiscriminate use of barrel bombs and other aerial bombardments of urban centers, which are designed to terrorize civilians, hundreds of thousands of whom have fled as a result. The United Nations is already doing a tremendous amount to reach Syrians in need with food assistance, safe water, shelter, and medicine. We are reaching millions, and yet even that is not enough. We will do everything we can to implement the due resolution and improve the humanitarian situation. Supplies are ready to go into areas that have been hard to reach and into the towns and cities that have been under siege. What we need is guaranteed safe passage for humanitarian supplies along key routes. The human suffering revealed during the recent ceasefires in Homs and Yarmouk highlighted the absolute urgency of getting aid to those who desperately need it. It is incumbent on the Syrian government and all parties to the conflict to reach these agreements. I call on the Syrian government to authorize more humanitarian staff and partners to work in Syria. It is not credible to cite bureaucratic procedures as reasons for delay when it is the government itself that controls those procedures. I call on the government and all parties to the conflict to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law. It is a basic principle and rule of war that civilians should be treated humanely. Denying access to people in urgent need of food, water, or medical supplies is a fundamental denial of their rights to life and human dignity. Yet, there are continued reports of sieges, massacres, and atrocities. The international community is strongly committed to pursuing justice and accountability for flagrant violation. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the resolution adopted this past Saturday reflects the heightened concern of the Security Council. I will closely monitor the situation and report to the Council in less than 30 days on its implementation. But let us remember that the resolution reflects responsibilities and obligations that are already included in the Geneva Conventions and other humanitarian and human rights laws. Let us also recall that the presidential statement adopted last October did not deliver the change that was expected. On the contrary, the government is besieging more than 200,000 civilians, while opposition groups are besieging some 45,000. Death by starvation is likely to be the result if this continues. I look to the General Assembly to make its unique and universal voice heard. I appeal to the international community to provide the funds needed for the response inside Syria and for those countries hosting people who have fled. The conflict has inflicted unimaginable suffering on the Syrian people for nearly 3 years. Their plight must drive us to pursue an end to the conflict with a renewed urgency. There must be a political transition towards a new Syria where all people and communities are guaranteed protection, rights, and freedoms. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Secretary General for his statement. I now give the floor to the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Ms. Pillay, who is joining us via video conference. Madam High Commissioner.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the General Assembly, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for this opportunity to brief you on the human rights situation in Syria. I take this opportunity to highlight some issues of foremost concern. Despite the welcomed convening of the Geneva II negotiations, the violence in Syria continues unbridled as all parties seemingly fail to grasp that there can be no military solution to the conflict. Attacks by government forces as well as by armed opposition groups continue to cause appalling loss of life, injury, and forced displacement. Massacres continue to be reported, with indications that some attacks are carried out along sectarian lines. The continued influx of arms and fighters from abroad diminishes the chances of reaching a political solution. Imprecise weaponry, notably the unrelenting use of barrel bombs by government forces, has reportedly resulted in hundreds killed and hundreds more wounded in the month of February alone in areas such as Aleppo, Daraa, Hama, and rural Damascus. The use of barrel bombs in this manner constitutes indiscriminate attacks. Aleppo has faced the brunt of these offenses as government forces have maintained a nearly daily bombardment since December 2013. To illustrate the level of devastation, in the short period between the 15th and 28th of December 2013, barrel bombs landed on more than 12 districts, exploding on residential buildings, marketplaces, a bus station, a school, and in close proximity to hospitals. This resulted in inhumane loss of life, as described to OHCHR by one witness of an attack on a bus station. I quote, "Bodies arrived in pieces. There were parts of bodies and parts of vehicles hanging on the power cable." A rescue worker told OHCHR this month, "I have retrieved from under the rubble scores of bodies of little children the age of my daughter. I have seen the horror in the eyes of the parents and siblings who have survived. The barrel bombs will stop sooner or later, but the pain and nightmares will accompany us forever, said this witness. Mass executions of individuals no longer participating in hostilities, as well as of civilians, have been carried out by some hardline opposition groups in Aleppo, Idlib, and al-Raqqa. Dozens of bodies, mostly handcuffed and blindfolded, were found in just one incident in Aleppo this January. Countless other people held by such groups may be at risk of a similar fate. This cruel conflict continues to tear families apart and inflicts increasingly brutal suffering on the innocent. Just last week, 5 school children were killed alongside an UNRWA staff member and 12 others in a heinous attack in Muzarib in southern Syria. Over 4 million children inside Syria are in danger in the line of fire, facing crushing poverty and alarming physical danger. Children have been forcibly disappeared, detained, tortured, subject to sexual violence, and in some cases, executed. Childhoods have been lost as some armed opposition groups have recruited children into hostilities. An entire generation of Syrian children is condemned to live with untold physical and psychological scars. Women also bear the scars of sexual violence, harassment, and forced displacement. All over Syria, families search desperately in vain for missing loved ones as government forces continue practices of arbitrary detention and enforced disappearance, including of women and children. Some remain unaccounted for since 2011. In a recent report, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Syria found that government forces have committed enforced disappearances as part of a widespread and systematic attack against the civilian population, amounting to a crime against humanity. Tens of thousands of persons are reportedly detained in official or unofficial government detention centers across the country, in some cases for years. Conditions are abhorrent, with routine starvation, lack of medical care, and overcrowding. The Commission of Inquiry has found that the government employed widespread and systematic torture. Armed opposition groups also increasingly hold individuals, allegedly subjecting them to torture and ill treatment. Over the past year, certain armed opposition groups have abducted civilians and held them hostage under threat of death, releasing them for ransom or prisoner exchange. These actions spare none, affecting religious figures, human rights defenders, journalists, and others. Now on sieges and detentions during evacuations. The world has watched humanitarian aid workers and volunteers bravely risk their lives to provide aid to those desperately in need in besieged areas. Harrowing accounts have been received by OHCHR of a man who risked being killed by sniper fire to bring medicine to his ailing mother, a doctor who was unable to administer life-saving treatment due to lack of medical supplies, and many people who have watched children and family members die of starvation and malnutrition. Last week, I released a thematic paper on sieges imposed by the government and by the armed opposition groups. Despite repeated and concerted efforts to provide humanitarian aid, tangible results for besieged communities are far from adequate. I hope those most in need will swiftly feel the impact of Saturday's Security Council resolution, which calls on parties to immediately lift sieges and allow urgent, unimpeded, and safe humanitarian access in Syria. Evacuations from besieged areas have been an important step forward, But attention must also be given to ensure that evacuees who are held following evacuations from old homes in February and Muadamia last October do not come to any harm and are treated in accordance with international humanitarian and human rights law. People who remain in old homes fear that government forces may launch a full-scale attack on the area. There must not be an assumption that those who remain in besieged areas are combatants. Meanwhile, regional consequences of this conflict continue, fueled by attacks along sectarian lines both inside and outside Syria. My office has received reports of the killing and abduction of religious figures, violence and forced displacement along sectarian lines, and the destruction of religious and cultural sites and symbols. The bloodshed must end. Parties to this conflict must seize opportunities for dialogue and negotiations. All parties must respect their obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law at all times. The Syrian people deserve a dignified future that includes peace and justice, with representative national institutions and political bodies inclusive of Syria's diverse population, committed to human rights for all. Women and minority groups have a critical role to play in peace building and reconciliation in Syria. International standards can provide the framework necessary to ensure equality, non-discrimination, justice, and harmony. I reiterate my calls for outside powers to curb their arms supplies and the inflow of foreign fighters into Syria. These imprudent actions destabilize the entire region, and subsequent tensions will not easily be reined in. I also commend and encourage the continuation of open borders by neighboring states, welcoming Syrians who wish to escape this conflict, and emphasize the need to respect the rights of all without discrimination. With regard to recommendations to the General Assembly, I welcome Resolution 67/262 adopted by this Assembly on 15 May 2013. But despite your calls for full and unfettered access by the Commission of Inquiry to Syria, my team based in the region and the Commission of Inquiry, both of whom continue to monitor violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, are de facto locked out of Syria. United Nations human rights bodies, including special procedures mandate holders, must gain access to Syria in order to engage constructively with parties on human rights concerns. Evidence continues to grow of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and gross human rights violations by government forces and armed opposition groups. The perpetrators of these appalling crimes act in defiance of law and the international community, without fear of accountability. Referral to justice is imperative for future hopes of peace. Today, I repeat again my call to the Security Council to refer the Syrian crisis to the International Criminal Court. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the Syrian people continue to suffer grievously. The depths of this pain cannot be conveyed through words. The international community, led by this Assembly, must support an immediate end to one of the most tragic human rights and humanitarian crises of our time. The failure to achieve a comprehensive ceasefire and accompanying violations should weigh heavily on our conscience. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, for Human Rights, for her briefing. I now give the floor to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, who's also joining us via video conference. Mr. Guterres.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the opportunity to address this assembly today. While my colleagues will brief you mainly on the situation inside Syria, I will focus on the neighboring countries where nearly 2.5 million Syrians have now registered as refugees with UNHCR. 5 years ago, Syria was the world's second largest refugee hosting country. Syrians are now about to replace Afghans as the present biggest refugee population worldwide. And it breaks my heart to see this nation that for decades welcomed refugees from other countries ripped apart and forced into exile itself. And I am humbled by the incredible generosity with which Syria's neighbors, in turn, shelter its refugees today. Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt continue to receive hundreds, even as thousands of Syrians every day. Neighboring countries have provided them with safety since the beginning at an enormous cost to themselves. Few refugee influxes have ever generated this profound an impact on their host countries with such dramatic demographic, economic, and social consequences. Let me give a few examples. Measured against the total population of Lebanon, the number of Syrian refugees currently registered there would be equivalent to nearly 15 million in France, 32 million in the Russian Federation, or 71 million in the United States. By the end of this year, the World Bank estimates that unemployment in Lebanon may double, an additional 170,000 Lebanese risk being pushed into poverty, and the total cost of the Syria crisis to the country could reach $7.5 billion US. I leave you to imagine the crushing economic and social effects such a situation would have on each one of your own countries. Turkey has already spent over $2.5 billion of its own budget directly assisting Syrian refugees. Jordan is also reeling under the refugee presence, estimating the related costs until now at some $1.7 billion US. And in this resource-poor country, the government is paying hundreds of millions worth of additional subsidies to ensure that refugees have access to affordable water, bread, gas, and electricity. But the crisis also puts heavy pressure on ordinary people. As budget deficits are increasing, growth suffers, and jobs, salaries, and price levels are affected across the region, leaving local families struggling to make ends meet. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, the human tragedies this conflict has created are ghastly, and although refugees may have found shelter from the fighting by crossing a border, they have not escaped their trauma and psychological wounds. Children are hardest hit, and over 1.2 million of them are now living as refugees. Little Wafa in Lebanon has barely spoken in the 12 months since she saw her father killed and the house destroyed in Syria. 15-year-old Khaled in Jordan is the only provider for his 3 younger siblings. Maram, not yet 2, got separated from her parents when crossing the Mediterranean by boat and spent weeks in an orphanage, waiting for them to be released from detention in another country and reunited with her. An entire generation of young Syrians is being shaped by violence, displacement, and the lack of education and opportunities. 2/3 of the refugee children and 3 million more inside Syria are out of school. Thousands became separated from their families during flight. Child labor is a widespread phenomenon in exile. Children who have seen things no child should ever see have been wounded physically or psychologically. And with every day the fighting drags on, these children are at risk of losing their future forever. This is why UNICEF, UNHCR, and other partners have launched a no-lost generation strategy, focusing on education, protection from abuse, and psychosocial care, which I hope will receive strong international support. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, much has been said about the profound implications this crisis has on regional and indeed global peace and security. Recent events in Iraq's Anbar province are clearly linked to what's happening in Syria, and so is the multiplication of violence incidents in Lebanon. Everyone knows that a further destabilization in the Middle East could have disastrous consequences for the rest of the world. In this context, I have 3 appeals to make to you today. First, there needs to be more international support to Syria's neighbors. Helping those countries to preserve the asylum space for people fleeing the conflict is crucial for regional stability. They need strong financial assistance, not only for immediate humanitarian priorities, but also for the structural, long-term development needs the crisis has created in them. Several mechanisms are already being established by host governments, together with the World Bank and UNDP, such as the Roadmap for Stabilization in Lebanon and the National Resilience Plan in Jordan. These and other national efforts must receive robust international support. My second appeal is for all countries, and especially those beyond the region, to allow Syrians to find refuge on their territories. There's something fundamentally wrong in a world where even people fleeing a conflict as horrific as this one are being pushed back from land borders or have to risk their lives at sea, submitting themselves to appalling human rights violations by smugglers and traffickers because they have no other way of reaching territories where they hope to find asylum. And third, as the conflict rages on and the neighboring states are already stretched beyond capacity, I hope more third countries will provide Syrian refugees with additional forms of protection. This includes resettlement and humanitarian admission programs, more flexible visa arrangements and family reunification mechanisms so as to allow Syrians to find safety without having to resort to high-risk entry channels like the ones I have mentioned. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, there is no military solution to this conflict, and the needed political one is not yet in sight. It's my profound hope that the ongoing negotiations with the support of member states that have influence over the parties will eventually help pave the way for an end to the fighting. But one thing is clear: humanitarian needs, both inside Syria and in the surrounding region, will remain high for years to come. In this context, it is crucial that all parties implement the recent Security Council resolution so as to alleviate human suffering. And as more and more refugees are telling us how impossible it was to cater for even their most basic survival needs inside Syria, real progress on implementing the resolution could also help to relieve pressure on the countries of the region. Syria's neighbors are making enormous sacrifices to protect those fleeing, a fundamental contribution to regional and global stability. For the international community, extending them the support they need to continue doing this is not a matter of generosity, but rather it is in their own best interests as the world continues to watch Syria disintegrate in bloodshed. Thank you very much.
I thank the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and I now give the floor to the Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Chan. Madam.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm speaking to you with a heavy heart. In March, the Syrian crisis will enter its 4th year. The long duration of the conflict has created a crisis for health. The health needs of the Syrian people are enormous, as is their suffering. In the course of this conflict, more than 100,000 people have been killed, and more than 600,000 have been injured. At least 6.5 million Syrians have been internally displaced, often crowded together under unsanitary conditions that favor the spread of disease. Another 2.3 million have fled to Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, and Egypt, creating a heavy burden on these countries. I wish to take this opportunity to commend these countries for their generosity. Health needs have skyrocketed at a time when domestic capacity to respond has been decimated. Syria, its previously excellent health system has collapsed in a significant number of areas. More than half of the country's public hospitals have been damaged, often following direct attacks, and many of them are no longer functioning. The number of doctors, nurses, and other healthcare workers still at work have dropped by more than half, and this situation is worse in some areas. A once vibrant pharmaceutical manufacturing industry has nearly ceased operations, resulting in severe shortages of drugs. Many patients with chronic diseases like heart disease, cancers, and diabetes are not being treated. Immunization programs, which used to reach 90% of children before the conflict, have been disrupted, leaving young children vulnerable to entirely preventable diseases. Safe childbirth is no longer readily available, placing pregnant women with life-threatening complications at heightened risk of losing their own lives giving birth. The suffering of the Syrian people is reflected in increased mental health disorders, food shortages, undernutrition, and an increase in sexual violence. The steep drop in childhood immunization opened the door for vaccine-preventable diseases to return to Syria. And they did, including polio. The first cases of polio in Syria since 1999 were reported in October 2013. This marked a significant risk and threat to Syria's children, but also a huge setback to the global initiative to eradicate polio. Many of you were commendable in supporting this initiative, including Mr. Secretary General. Most significantly, it confirmed the renewed vulnerability of the Syrian people to diseases that had long disappeared from the country. Since the detection of the polio cases in October, 4 mass vaccination campaigns have been conducted in the country, and the most recent campaigns undertaken in January and February of this year, WHO in collaboration with UNICEF and supported by other partners, try our best. And I think the recent campaigns appear to have reached all districts in all governorates. Preliminary results indicated that immunization coverage was higher than 80% in all but 2 governorates. However, ladies and gentlemen, in order to control the outbreak within Syria, additional efforts on a similarly large scale need to be sustained until June this year, and more polio immunization campaigns must be conducted to protect the 22 million children in the neighboring countries, to prevent the spread of polio to them and beyond, because the future of many children and a worldwide polio eradication effort are at stake. Ladies and gentlemen, last year, life-saving medicines and supplies reached nearly 5 million Syrians. Of course, much more needs to be done, despite all these great difficulties. All of these efforts to address the deteriorating health situation are being conducted under extreme difficulty and in very dangerous situations. I take this opportunity to pay tribute to the men and women, the healthcare workers who risk their life in providing support to the Syrian people. As I said, despite the greatest possible will to provide assistance, lack of access to people in need, wherever they reside, remains the most critical barriers to improving the health situation in Syria. I began my intervention with a heavy heart, and let me conclude with a heartfelt plea. All parties in the conflict must respect the integrity and neutrality of health facilities. they must ensure the protection of healthcare workers and patients in line with their obligations under international humanitarian law. On that, Mr. President, thank you.
I thank the Director General of the World Health Organization for her briefing. I now give the floor to the Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator, Ms. Kang.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished delegates, on behalf of the USG for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator Valerie Amos, I thank you for this opportunity to brief the General Assembly on the humanitarian situation in Syria. During the 3 years of conflict, the death toll had reached well over 100,000 many months ago, and over 680,000 have been injured. And the relentless violence and brutality continues. More than 9.3 million people are in need of assistance inside Syria, including at least 6.5 million who are internally displaced. Just this month, an estimated 500,000 people were forced to leave from eastern Aleppo city and rural Aleppo, following intense fighting in the area. And with the situation becoming increasingly dire, the number of people fleeing Syria continues to grow, with crippling impact on the host communities in the neighboring countries that are bearing an enormous burden, as the High Commissioner for Refugees has very powerfully presented. Despite constant calls for the parties to the conflict to abide by international humanitarian law, violations are reported on a daily basis. Civilians are under fire, and the social fabric has been torn to shreds, with reports of horrific human rights violations, including sexual and gender-based violence. Every day, we hear of indiscriminate attacks, the use of heavy weapons, aerial bombings, including the use of barrel bombs, mortars, and car bombs in densely populated areas. In the same town in Daraa, where Palestinian refugee school children and UNRWA staff were killed and many more injured when an explosive struck near UNRWA's Zaytin school in Mujairib, as already mentioned by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, just 8 days earlier, an explosion had injured 40 school children at another UNRWA school. It is unacceptable that international humanitarian and human rights law continues to be flagrantly violated by all parties to the conflict. All parties are failing in their responsibility to protect civilians. Mr. President, the long-term trauma and emotional impact of this humanitarian catastrophe for future generations of Syrians are chilling. Nearly 4.3 million children in Syria are affected by the conflict, and more than 1.2 million more have been forced out of Syria as refugees. Children have been killed, arrested, abducted, tortured, mutilated, sexually abused, and recruited by armed groups. They have been used as human shields. They are malnourished. Syria is in the danger of losing a generation of its children. Essential infrastructure has been destroyed and militarized by parties to the conflict, including more than 4,000, or 18% of Syria's 22,000 schools. Healthcare systems have collapsed, as Dr. Chan has already mentioned. Water supply has decreased by 50% from pre-crisis levels. Even Syria's ancient cultural heritage has not been spared. Many of its sites have been used for military purposes and attacked and irreparably damaged, taking a part of our shared human history with them. These numbers grow every day and have become routine news. Perhaps they no longer shock, but they must. It is critical that we remember that behind each number is a family, a child, whose life has been ended or devastated. Mr. President, despite the insecurity and lack of access, humanitarian workers continue to do their utmost to help the 9.3 million people in need throughout the country. Since the onset of the crisis, over 50 humanitarian workers have been killed, including 15 UN staff and 34 Syrian Arab Red Crescent staff and volunteers. Just 2 weeks ago, United Nations and SARC workers were shelled when carrying out a humanitarian operation inside the old city of Homs. All parties to the conflict should be reminded that it is a war crime to fire on those carrying out humanitarian operations. The perpetrators must be held accountable. Despite the worsening security environment, United Nations agencies and partners remain committed to staying and delivering in Syria. They continue to reach millions of people with life-saving assistance day after day. WFP now reaches almost 4 million people each month, half of whom are in opposition-held or contested areas. UNICEF and partners' interventions enabled around 10 million people to get safe water across the country in 2013. UNHCR and partners have provided core relief items to 4.8 million people. UNICEF supported a Back to Learning campaign, delivering school supplies to 1.5 million conflict-affected children. UNRWA is assisting the nearly 500,000 Palestine refugees in Syria with health, education, and food assistance. UNFPA has assisted 1.8 million women with emergency reproductive health care, while WHO and other health partners helped 3.6 million with consultations and treatments. WFP and UNICEF continue supporting national campaign against polio, as Dr. Chan mentioned. Delivery through cross-line interagency convoys to hard-to-reach areas continue. Since January 2013, 58 cross-line convoys delivered one-off assistance to hard-to-reach areas, providing some aid to millions of people, over half in opposition-held or contested areas. Yet, each convoy carries assistance for only a few thousand people, thus falling far short of covering all the needs in these hard-to-reach areas. Despite our best efforts to scale up response, there are still 3.3 million people in urgent need of assistance in hard-to-reach areas that we cannot reach systematically. And as fighting continues and conflict lines shift, we fear many more will become trapped. 240,000 people are already besieged by either the government or the opposition, some of whom have been cut off from aid for 2 years. They are desperate for help and an escape from the constant fighting, shelling, and snipers. Parties to the conflict must facilitate safe and unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance to all the people in need, including in hard-to-reach and besieged areas. Despite persistent requests and negotiations, we have had only very limited improvement in the past months in reaching those besieged. Agreement between the parties last month allowed UNRWA to deliver assistance to over 6,800 Palestine refugee families, and the Palestine Red Crescent and SARC to evacuate hundreds of people from Yarmouk camp. But regular and sustained access is needed. The recent humanitarian operation in the besieged old city of Homs allowed the evacuation of close to 1,400 civilians and the provision of assistance to 2,500 people who had been trapped in the area since late 2012. Workers saw the scale of devastation. The people who left Homs are thin, malnourished, and traumatized. Our colleagues reported the destruction of the old city with not a single building left unscathed. The hospital in Homs has extremely limited medical supplies and staff and no equipment. It was described as a place to die, not a place to be saved. The operation in the old city of Homs was a breakthrough for the few thousand people evacuated and assisted after such a long siege. But it is only a very small piece of the larger, horrific picture of devastation. Action to facilitate humanitarian access and the delivery of aid is urgent. Mr. President, in addition to improved security, there is also a need to address the remaining administrative challenges that will allow for a scaling up of assistance. While we have had some limited progress, much more needs to be done so that humanitarian organizations can bring the staff and expertise to deliver more help to more people. The Syrian authorities must also take action to bring down the bureaucratic obstacles to the delivery of humanitarian goods, including medical and surgical supplies, to all in need throughout the country through the most effective, efficient, and direct routes. Opposition groups, some of which have openly threatened aid workers, must also allow access and guarantee the safety of humanitarian workers and must not politicize aid deliveries. Mr. President, we are in a race against time. More people are slipping out of our reach as the conflict intensifies and armed groups fragment and more battle lines are drawn. We desperately need a political solution to the conflict in Syria. Yet, while a political solution is in the making, we must do all we can to drastically expand the course of humanitarian action in Syria today. Civilians must be protected and able to receive the assistance they need. Parties that fail to uphold their international legal obligations, including the protection of civilians, must be held accountable for their action and inaction. Mr. President, just a few days ago, the Security Council adopted a landmark resolution on the humanitarian situation in Syria.